Everybody, welcome back. We continue tonight in the middle of chapter 43, still towards the beginning of the chapter. It's not as long as the 42nd chapter, but it's still considered towards the beginning. It's on page 122, and it is pretty much in the center of the page. There's a dot there, so it's easy to pick up. The words begin Achayira. You could see it as well in the corresponding English text. And for all newcomers, we always invite you to see all the previous classes. I would just even add this to appreciate today's class. Got to pick up and the last two classes for that matter. Which I believe then we began Perek Mem Gimel, this 43rd chapter, and you could find it on the website of the TanyaOnline.com. Easy to follow, easy access to all the previous classes, all the way from the very beginning. And it's also easy to follow the classes. We mentioned many times there's a separate scroll bar for the text, and as such, again, easy to follow. So we continue Achayiri Lo, however, the supreme Yira. Now, supreme as opposed to the inferior Yira. Yira is awe, reverence of Hashem. So we discussed last week, as you all remember, that there is a Yira, which on the surface it seems to be something very special and something very unique and something very great. And Alter Rebbe himself calls it Gadlus, grandness, greatness, because it's about a meditation, a pondering experience of meditation on the Gdulas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Gdulas Hashem, in the expression of the Alter Rebbe, in the term of the Alter Rebbe, the greatness of Hashem, the grandness of Hashem. Hence, it's Gadlus, it's a Yira, which expresses grandness, and yet Alter Rebbe suggests there or notes there that this is as great as it seems to be. Nonetheless, it's an inferior yira. It's a fear which comes of a yizbeinus, a meditation on the inferior dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you will, the way that Hashem is memalik kol almin, how Hashem invests in these in His garments. In other words, our appreciation is about Hashem's garments, to which Hashem, the famous three expressions, is brought out of places in Chassidus as well, but which comes over here. It's noted over here. Mistater umisalem umislabish bahem. He hides, he conceals himself, and invests. So the whole meditation is on these garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where Hashem Himself is hiding there. As such, the yira, the fear, the arousal of the reverence. The reverence, the fear, the awe itself, which is aroused rather through this hisbeinanut, this meditation, is tata, is an inferior experience, or experience. The sensation is an inferior sensation of fear, because again it comes of the levushim, of the garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where Hashem is hiding. And as we mentioned, the whole idea of memalik kol almin, what is produced is this, which by definition is inferior. It's certainly not about Hashem Himself. Olam, as again we quoted the Gemara, the Olam, the Gemara says in Lashon Helam, Behester, is an expression of concealment over the truth of the core truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is basically the message over here in this very chapter, in this very beginning of Mem Gimel, describing this experience. And this is the reason, as the Alter Rebbe explained last week, why it's called Tata. It's Gadlus, it's greatness, because it's pondering on the Gdulas Hashem, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but yet it is inferior Yira. It's focusing on areas where Hashem hides, Hashem conceals Himself. And here again, in order to have clarity of this noted, it's those of you who weren't here last week, newcomers online, it's important to appreciate the message over here, and this, which again we recap over here, is to go to the last class, or even more from the last two classes. Achayiri Lo. What would be considered superior fear, superior awe? This is yira baishis. This is a fear of shame. V'yira pnimis, an inwardness type of reverence. Again, just translating the words. Why is it pnimis? Why is it about inwardness? Why is it about the lashon here pnimis? Why? Because it comes from the pnimis of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not from the garment where Hashem is hiding, but the Hashem himself, which is in this hiding position. In other words, in focusing on Hashem the way he is by himself, for himself, or the way Hashem is beyond hiding, investing, concealing himself, which was the meditation of this, which we spoke about last week. Gdulas Hashem, yes, but Hashem's garments, where he hides. This is the pnimius of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is Hashem himself. And therefore, the yira is an inward yira. It's a pnimisdiki type of yira. Now we will explain what does it mean, an inward yira, but let's go on. Because it is aroused and it comes from, it evolves from the pnimius elokus, the pnimius of godliness, shebeseicha elamis, which is in the world. In other words, not the meditation is on the levush, on the world itself, which are mailam master, which conceal the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's about pondering on this which is hiding. In other words, this which is hiding, meaning Hashem himself, right? Someone goes into a sack, you know something is there, but you're meditating on the sack, and then you open the sack and you see, no, there's a person in the sack, and it's a different type of appreciation, it's a different type of interaction. Not something which you believe that because he's in there, in this case a sack usually not only cover, in this case really only covers, the man is not really producing through this making anything of the sack alive, being him in there. But let's say there's some accomplishment of man in a system, so you appreciate what he's accomplishing, but you're not encountering, you're not interacting with him himself. And as opposed to when you open up, you say, here's the person. Different idea. And the same thing, the Yirat Tata is produced from the levushim, the garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem hides in them. Lashon again, hides, conceals, invests in them. The Yirat Pnimius comes from the Pnimius of Elokus, which is the Pnimius, again, Elokus, which is in the Elamis, Hashem himself. Oleo Omru, and this is what the Mishnah states, Imein Chochma ein Yira. That if there's no Chochma, there's no Yira, there's no fear. Because this is Chochma, the simple meaning, the simple understanding of this. Chochma is the Torah, because last week we said, Imein Yira ein Chochma. You have to get to the Chochma Satayra, to be connected with Chochma Satayra and Hashem's mitzvahs. You have to have that Yira Tata, inferior Yira. But here the Alter Rebbe teaches, we need the Torah mitzvahs, because here you're entering into a much deeper level within Hashem. And as such, and a much deeper level within Hashem, and you need to be very careful with the Chochmah of Hashem, which is the total observance and complying with Hashem's Torah, scrupulous with Hashem's mitzvahs, in thought and speech and action. You have to be complete, because you're entering into a pnimistic area, an area of Hashem himself, which is supposed to arouse an inner type of fear. Granted, that's also the meaning of Emein Chochma in here, but the Alter Rebbe teaches over here Emein Chochma with a different taich. It's not a total contradiction. The Alter Rebbe is coming from a different dimension within Chochma itself. What is Chochma? Chochma is Koyach Ma. We mentioned many times that Chochma is about bittul, even in the progress, the way, or the evolution of seichel, of intellect, and for that matter, grasping any concept. It begins with the flash. Again, we're not going to elaborate on this. You can go right to the 3rd chapter, which we did, perhaps throughout up till now, we just did mention it. Perhaps in a little more of a elaboration, also more than what we're going to do now, but namely in clear explanation and articulation. This chokhmah, as opposed to bina, which is the evolution of intellect processing any concept, appreciating, understanding, absorbing a concept. It begins with a flash, which is chokhmah. Flash says it's similarly like a lightning. It's very bright when the first approach, when you're putting your mind to something, and you obviously have the ability. It's your language and something that you can. Obviously, there's something which you have the ability of figuring it out, but you didn't figure it out yet. What happens is you put your mind to it, and all of a sudden, it makes sense. And it's very clear. There's a certain sharpness. You appreciate what those words mean. Or sometimes, you look at a Rashi, and you see there's a few extra words, and you want to just know, you know the Rashi, those were extra words. Those are the extra words in Rashi. Every word ought to shine, because if you understand the concept clearly, you realize and you appreciate every word, every nuance, especially someone like Rashi. But till you do it, and you don't want to just go through and say, okay, it's just a few words. You want to understand it thoroughly, so you put your mind to it, and all of a sudden there's a flash. It says, wow, now it's clear. What happens after? Someone would ask you, what did you figure out? Even two people are trying to figure this out. You say, give me a moment, I gotta develop it. And again, this is the way it works in everything, but let's use let's say a Rashi. Let's say you're looking and it just clicks, and then someone would ask you right then, what did you jump? What did you get all excited about? In other words, what happened? No, it was so clear a minute ago, but let me just put my mind to it to try to have it fixed in a way that it could be literally like tangible. So I could be able to say, this is the Rashi, look, this is what it means. That is the transition from Chokhmah to Bina. Bina is about expansiveness, taking that Nakuda, expanding on that Nakuda. On that Nakuda means like on that flash. So again, go back to chapter 20 and third. Easy access within literally a click, and you could see the idea of how Alter Rebbe explains Chokhmah, Koyach Ma. It's about bittul, like what? In other words, it's very strong, it's very potent, the message, but nonetheless, it's intangible, meaning to say you cannot, it's like a little bit like a lightning. You're walking in the street at night, someone's walking with you, they didn't pay attention, his eyes were closed, whatever it is, and all of a sudden the sky, there's a flash in the sky, a lightning. It's bright, it's very bright. And you jump, you say, wow. And your friend, which didn't see it right then, says, so what did you jump for? You can't pinpoint that flash because it came and it went within a split second. It's very clear, the skies are very clear, it was very bright, but it came and it left. And the same thing, that initial approach, that initial appreciation, after toiling in a concept, it's very bright but intangible. That's koyach malik what? Now, that is about bittul. It's again, many times in Chassidus, it's explained, famous Hagah note of the Alter Rebbe in the 35th chapter, Kasha Shamaiti Meiri, that's why Chokhmah is a keli, it's a vessel, it's a conduit, it's a susceptible to the Ein Sof. Why? Because Chokhmah is about bittul, because it's koyach ma, it's before expansion. Again, it stays with that nekuda, very strong, but yet bittul. It's a flash, it's a koyach, but nonetheless ma. So the Alter Rebbe says you reveal the koyach ma within you, which means you realize that in the end of the day, you look to the very deeper core of the entire creation, and you realize that in essence everything is truly batul to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the extent of in essence not even existent. Now, this is also a concept which you have to appreciate. In order to appreciate thoroughly, you have to go to the chapters Chof and Chof Aleph. Well, the Alter Rebbe explains there that in essence, from the perspective of God, there is no Elamus, there's no worlds. In other words, it's not that there is Hashem and there is worlds which were created by Hashem. Hashem has full control over everything, so nothing goes without His dictate. Every single nuance, every single detail which exists is vitalized by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem is in control, and nothing could slip away. It's not only the case, well, that's granted, that's true, but it doesn't begin from there. The reason is because from Hashem's perspective, is Lashon Alter Rebbe, Hashem hu Elikim. Everything is about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The world is really not existent in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Alter Rebbe explains, like speech, the way before the expression there of the Alter Rebbe, you have to, again, it's just no one minds to repeat it. It's such a geschmack idea. Nonetheless, why overly indulge in something that we already, in other words, in its explanation, when it was done, the Alter Rebbe himself elaborates, indulges in this idea in the 20th and 21st chapter. So again, it's a click away. You can appreciate the entire idea. But what the Alter Rebbe's vart is there is that from Hashem's perspective, there is no Eilam. We gave the example also a master and a pupil, which we didn't mention this example a few times, I believe, there as well when we learned this chapter 20 and 21. This is the Alter Rebbe. We mentioned also, this is famous vart by Avraham Avinu, picked up on this when he demonstrates Hashem's name to all the past buyers and again his influence on the entire world, introducing monotheism, the Hashem Echad, to the entire world. The pasuk says, "Vayikra Shem b'Shem Hashem Keileilam," that he calls upon. The Medrash says, "Al Tikra Vayikra Vayakri." He established, he brought this acquaintance of God to everybody, and the pasuk is Keil Olam. Keil Olam, not Keil HaOlam. The Ramban points this out, not God as a God of the world, which it suggests that there is a world and Hashem is a God over this world. He is in control, but yet is a separate entity. No, from the perspective of Hashem Elokim, again explained in Perek Chav Aleph, there is nothing else. There's only Hashem. Keil Olam. Olam is part of that reality of Hashem, which is expressed in a way of Olam, but it's not a separate entity, and as we explain, which we say every single day in davening, there's no two entities, just like before Hashem created the world, it was only Hashem, now it's still only Hashem. The fact that you see a world does not contradict that overwhelming, or that oneness, that pure oneness of a presence of the oneness of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Hashem Hu Helikim. So from that perspective, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say over here, that we realize the nothingness, the true nothingness of everything in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything is batal. Everything is a non-existent entity, as like nothing is no thing at all. And things, whatever we see in front of our eyes, and from the true perspective, it's completely batal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem is right here, exactly before He created the world, and the way He and at this point as well, it exists in the same exact fashion. It's not a world comes into being and Hashem controls this world, but yet another entity. From Hashem's perspective, there is no other entity. Again, as explained there in detail. So from that perspective, this is what arouses a total different quality type of fear, because it's not about focusing on Hashem's garments, meaning the elements which Hashem vitalizes and constantly energizes. Again, the meditation which arouses the inferior yira, a yira which is about the focusing, again, is a result of the meditation of Hashem's garments. This is the meditation on Hashem Himself, and when you look at Hashem Himself from the perspective of Hashem, there is no elements, nothing exists. So the fear is naturally a total different qualitative type of fear, which, as opposed to the fear which is aroused as a result of focusing on Hashem's garments, on the elements, on the worlds. This is focusing on Hashem Himself, and again, from Hashem's perspective, everything is batal. So what it arouses the yira, the type of fear is, it's a total bitul b'metzias. We explained also last week, we touched upon it 2 weeks ago, namely, you can see it again 2 classes before this class, the difference of bitul ayesh, that I am, but I know that my whole metzias comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. My whole being comes from Hashem. Bitul b'metzias means there is nothing. It's a complete nullification, and because I'm focusing, my meditation is on the essence of Hashem, where from that perspective, Hashem or Elokim, there isn't anything else. And then there isn't anything, so there's nothing of my metzias. It's not I am, and I recognize there is no I to begin with, from that perspective and point of view. So everything is completely batal. The yira is a total different yira. It's a fear which is about a complete submission. It's only Hashem. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe says yira baish, it's a certain shame, like, how can anything happen? just one note, it's worthwhile. I don't know if it's exactly in this context. It's like the Rebbe Rashab has a word in Ayin Beis, in the famous work, and the famous discourse, which is Ayin Beis, corresponds to that year, Tafresh Ayin Beis. He says from a certain perspectives, an Oived Hashem, which considers himself, or even without things, the fact that he recognizes that he's serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is a merida, it's a rebellion in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because anything which demonstrates any type of I, even a subtle I, in other words, identifying yourself even subtly, and more so, the Lashon of the Rebbe Rashab, the Chiddush of the Rebbe Rashab, novelty of this Vart is that you're not recognizing yourself, again, separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To the contrary of your submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your Avaveda, I am serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or rather, it's your service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but yet, because there's a subtle I am serving, all that stuff really doesn't exist from the true perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, not an illusionist. In the end of the day, Bereshis bara Elokim Hashem Hashem created the world with a purpose and we are meant to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But from the true HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Pano, when a person appreciates the Pnimis of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is no I to begin with. So I am serving, doing all this stuff. That's kind of from a certain perspective, that's a rebellion. Because from the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing exists, including yourself. And this is one of the things the Alter Rebbe says, don't take yourself out of the klal. We're going to see it in the text over here, but the Alter Rebbe, just to jump over here to this expression of the Alter Rebbe, don't exclude yourself, your body, your soul, your spirit, your body, again, your soul, your spirit, and your neshama are completely bottle, completely non-existent in the face of Hashem's energy. So where's the I am serving? It's a merida by definition. It's rebellion by definition. Now, we continue to serve because of what Hashem wants, but from this perspective, we have to appreciate this vart of the Rebbe Rashab, which is again this idea of this inner fear, because my pondering is on the inner pnimius of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is in the elements. In other words, the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which from the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing exists. So there's no I to begin with. It's not I am recognizing Hashem. There is no I, which is again the difference of bittul yesh. It is, but batul. It is, but nullifies itself as bittul b'mitzias means to say it's total nullity. It's a total expression of nullity, because there is nothing which is batul. It's not one entity submissive to something else. In this case, to Hashem. From Hashem's perspective, there is no starting point over here. So let's see it inside in the text. Chochma is from ayin. It's found literally. It's also translated that the chochma comes from a place of ayin. Chochma is found from ayin, as it says in a number of places. In Chassidus, ayin is keser, because keser you cannot even define. Chochma is the very beginning. Despite chochma is the nekuda, the connecting, the intermediary between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the subsequent midas, because again chochma has that bittul, but nonetheless chochma is the starting point of Seder Ishtalshelus. We mentioned this in the past, and chochma comes from ayin, from a place which is beyond description. One period, but Alter Rebbe says in this case the chochma could understand the koyach ma, that koyach of the neshama, which is about bittul, could understand that everything really comes from ayin, or everything in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is truly ayin, is truly non-existent. Let's see in terms of Alter Rebbe. Again, another description from our Chachamim, when it talks about Chachma, it says, who is a Chacham, not a Mavin, but a Chacham. He sees this which is going to be produced. The literal meaning again, a Chacham again, the literal meaning, never to forget, there's a literal meaning of the Mishnah, who's a Chacham, he sees what is going to be produced from this. So in the very beginning, before everything evolves, he already makes the right decision. Doesn't wait for things to evolve and then realize how many mistakes he made. He's able to have farsight, because he sees what is going to lead from this step, from that step to that step. So he makes the right choice on the onset in order that it should evolve correctly, smoothly, without any complications. You see the Neilad. And the Alter Rebbe, again, you see this which is going to be produced, is going to give birth to what is going to, how it's going to evolve. But the Alter Rebbe's Pirush is that the Ezel Chacham Haroyes HaNeilad, you see from the very beginning how things are, the evolution of things, how things were born, meaning to say how they came into being, that you know that it's me'ayin, right? The Chacham appreciates that ayin, which is Hashem himself, and as such, you know that from the ayin, that's how things came into being. So from Hashem's perspective, from that ayin's perspective, there isn't anything. And the Chacham is a roya. He sees that, he meditates on that, and as such, it arouses an enormous sense of bittul, complete self-nullification, but again, to a state, from a state that there is no self at all, because he focuses on the ayin, he sees everything the way it comes from Hashem's perspective. And that's what he says, Sheroye kol davar, he sees eich neilad v'nishave me'ayin liyesh, how everything was brought into being, was born, let's call it, was produced, and came into being, me'ayin liyesh, again classically known as ex nihilo, from ayin to yesh. I mean to say it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, bidvar Hashem v'ruach piv yizbarach, from the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the spirit of Hashem's mouth, like it says in the pasuk v'ruach piv kol tzavam, that all the heavenly army, or even the earthly army. This the heavenly army could be translated the sun, the moon, and others, the grand creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the worldly, the obvious, and again, this is considered also world or inferior army as well, because there's beyond the sun and the moon, there's the spiritual worlds. Obviously, they're much grander. They are defined so differently and distinctly, naturally, than this physical world. But nonetheless, there's Tzva Shamayim, literally translated the sun and the moon, where you see Hashem's grandness. But there's the Tzva Ha'aretz, there's the wind, and how everything is developed in the earth, and the again grand created beings, even on this in Oretz, again Tzva Shamayim and Tzva Ha'aretz, Hashem's the earthy, or the inferior, the army of the Oretz, and then the army of Shamayim. All these grand created beings, again, not negating over here anything which is not grand, but he calls it the Tzva Shamayim. In other words, the might, in this context would be the might of the earth and the might of the heaven, and which reflects naturally on the grander created beings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything, and again, it's not exclusive to the tzava, everything, heaven and earth, and to the smallest details of heaven and earth, are all created mi'ayin liyesh. So it comes from the ayin. Everything comes from the ayin, and in the face of the ayin, there is no yesh. Hashem hu elikim, as we explained, and again, the word that one needs to appreciate in order to understand this thoroughly. It's important to go back to those previous chapters. In other words, to the chapters of Chaf and Chaf Aleph, and therefore, and as such, because everything continues to be created of Hashem's energy, bidvar Hashem shamayim nasu uveruach piv kol tzvaam, everything comes from a state of ayin to a state of yesh. In other words, the same yesh, when you look at the sun or the moon or every part of creation, it comes and constantly is vitalized via or by that ayin. And from the perspective, in other words, it doesn't have any independent existence. Even if you see it physically, it still doesn't have an independent existence. It's only because we're looking from our perspective. Remember, we spoke about that example of the pupil and the teacher. The pupil could perceive his teacher as a storyteller, even though he's the greatest guy and the greatest genius in Torah, let's go, the greatest prodigy, the greatest, most profound mind, and he is challenged with teaching this student which never heard of any concepts in Torah. So he has to teaspoon this child, young in age, young in his stage, in his perception, in his knowledge. So sometimes he has to contract his whole flow of knowledge. Sometimes he has this teaspoon of child, not only minimal information, but the quality of the information many times has to be translated or submitted to him by an example, by a story. And slowly but surely he starts passing more and more of the information till the Gemara says that a person would take 40 years to reach the level of his master, of his teacher. But in the very beginning, when the child is sitting across the table, he thinks this man is a storyteller, or anybody walking into the room for that matter. Wow, what a beautiful story, what a great storyteller. He's not a storyteller. He never loses his profound appreciation and the entire Talmud or whatever he knows, again, his amkus, his depth, and his vast knowledge doesn't go away for a moment, even when he's speaking that mashal, that parable to this child, because he's trying to convey a particular message of Torah. He never becomes a storyteller. It's just from the perspective of the child, he sees somebody hears to him, he looks like a storyteller. But from the perspective of the master, it's a full, again, even as he's saying the story, as he's saying the parable, it's fully a flow, of constant flow of profound appreciation and understanding and a vast knowledge in the entire Torah. Again, let's speak about a chachmas Torah, the wisdom of Torah. From Hashem's perspective, if you look at it from the ayin perspective, so from our perspective, it's yesh mi ayin. There's a yesh. But if you look to the core, the kechma, chochma mi ayin timotzei, ve'ezeu chochma reyes hanel, he sees really where it's coming from, which is the ayin. From the perspective of the ayin, there is no olam, there is no yesh. And the chacham is able to see that it was the koich of chachma, which exists within every single yid, because again, which is part and parcel of who he is. He has a neshama, and neshama is divided into 10, as the Alter Rebbe begins the 3rd chapter of Tanya. And the chachma is the reishis, is the very beginning of that neshama experience. So because of the chachma, which is again part and parcel of who the yid is, and is able to appreciate this idea to be rayas hanayla, to realize that chachma me'ayin timotzei, that everything is found from the ayin. So the real kayach over here of everything which stands in front of one's face is ultimately right now receiving its energy from the ayin. It doesn't have no independent energy. So your focus is not on the created being and knowing that one way or another it has a creator which is pumping energy to create it. You're not focusing on the created being. You're focusing on the ayin itself. You're focusing on the energy. And from the perspective of the energy, from the perspective of Hashem, like from the perspective of the teacher, there is nothing exists. It just doesn't exist. Hashem Elikim, it's not there. And if you focus on the ayin, because you have that koach ma within you, that's part and parcel of who you are, you're able to appreciate the ayin, that everything timotze from the ayin. Similarly, you see the nailad, you visualize how everything is born. It's born, it comes into being because of the Dvar Hashem and Beruach Piv, and therefore from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing truly exists. Hashem Hu Elikim. For that matter, this is the conclusion of the Alter Rebbe's words in Perek Chafal. Alter Rebbe elaborates also in Shari Yechav Emunah this very concept. But back in Chav Chafal, which Alter Rebbe sends you over here, that's the end of Chafal. Hashem Hu Elikim. Nothing exists in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as such, therefore he says, Shamayim, V'oretz, heaven and earth, V'chol Tzavam, and the entire army of heaven and earth, the entire might of heaven and earth, not only bitla yesh, from the perspective of the ayin, it's completely batal. It's completely nullified in the Dvar Hashem, in the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Baruch Piv, in the spirit of Hashem's mouth. Which that's where their whole existence comes to being. So you focus on the ayin, you realize that everything is really part of the ayin. Part of the Ruach Piv, part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Until therefore, as such, completely insignificant. Ve'ayin ve'efes mamish, they stand with a total 100% nullity in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki bitolei v'ziv hashemesh b'guf hashemesh atzma, like the nullification of the ray of the sun within the ball of the sun. And again, we spoke about this in the past as well. But let's try to say this brief over here. Where does the ray stand a chance to shine, to send off its radiance? When it's out of the ball of the sun. So there's the ball of the sun, and then the ray begins to perform. Now, as the Alter Rebbe says, if that very ray is able to perform out of the ball of the sun, that tells you, without a doubt, that the same ray is within the ball of the sun. In other words, if it has that koyach, that energy to perform, in other words, to send this enormous light and this enormous radiance out of the ball of the sun, this ziv, this ray, must be within the ball of the sun. In other words, how much more so it has to be within. Because if it's without, for sure, for certain, it has to be within. The only problem, or the only difference, say it more accurately, is when it's within the ball of the sun, it doesn't perform. It has greater intensity because it's closer to the sun. Not only it's closer to the sun, it's within the ball of the sun. The only thing is, it doesn't have the ability to perform. You cannot see. The ray cannot produce itself as a ray. Why? Because it's overwhelmed by the illuminator itself, by the ball of the sun itself. So there is no appearance of any ray. Where do you start seeing the ray? After the end of the sun, after the end, so to say, of the illuminator of the sun itself, the luminescent, which is the sun itself, then the ray could appear again with its radiance and so on, its light, its warmth, and so on. So certainly if it's out of the sun, for sure it's within the ball of the sun. But within the ball of the sun, it cannot perform. Meaning to say you can't see it because it's overwhelmed from the ball of the sun itself. In other words, it stands with a complete self-nullification to the ball of the sun itself. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. And that when you look at the reality of Eilam Hazeh, or any level, in other words, the reality of Eilam is, you know that within you focus not on the Eilam itself, but you focus on the Ayin, on the Elokus, the godliness which is vitalizing all this, heaven and earth, and all the might of heaven and earth, physical and even in spirit, and even spiritual. You know, from the perspective of the Ayin, nothing exists, and it's as if the everything which is produced is within the system of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and similar to the ray, the way it's within the sun. And why isn't it performing? Why doesn't it have the ability to express itself? Because it's overwhelmed by the sun itself. And as such, it's not hiding within the sun to say I'm shining, but you can't see me. Because when it's in the ball of the sun, it doesn't exist. Again, within the ball of the sun, it's not like it has a certain spot within the ball of the sun that it's performing, but you can't see it because you're looking at the ball of the sun. No, when the ray is within the ball of the sun, which we have to say it is, again, if it could express itself out of it, for sure, it's within the ball of the sun, but within the ball of the sun, it stands in a total state of nothingness, true nothingness, because what is the ball of the sun. And so to everything which is created from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the perspective of the Ayin, from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, everything is truly not, because it's just Hashem. And because it's just Hashem, things are truly not. They're truly batul. Not only they exist, again, the expression of bitul hayesh, that I am, I recognize that my chayis comes from such and such. From the perspective of Ayin, there is nothing. And if there is nothing, everything stands in true nullity to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the perspective of this Ayin, everything is truly not. Alter Rebbe continues, don't take yourself out of the rule. You know, I'm the guy who got to figure this out. So I am, at least. No. If nothing is, you're also not. So as you're pondering on this, realize that it's about you as well. such an appreciation to these words. You feel you're the one who's misbein and you're pondering on this idea, so you are, because you're trying to figure something out. Alter Rebbe says, if you really chap, in other words, if you're chachma, if you're kayach ma, that enormous kayach of the neshama is figuring this out, that mi'ayin timatze, that everything comes from ayin, or your royas hanaylad, you also include yourself, that you're also not, because your focus is on the ayin, which from the perspective of the ayin, nothing is, nothing exists. And that's why it says, don't you take yourself out of this rule, because also your body, your body, your soul, your spirit, and again your neshama, deeper level within expression of the neshama, is batul b'mitzias b'dvar Hashem, is completely nullified, totally nullified, in the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'diburi yisbarach, b'dvar Hashem, and the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and v'diburi yisbarach michud b'machshavtei, and the words of the words are just like it is lahavdil by a human being, is batul to the machshava, to the thought. Dr. Rebbe is again alluding to this Perek Chaf and Chaf Aleph. He says, I explained it barichas, b'derech mashal, I explained it in length, in elaboration, as an example from the soul of man, because again you can argue, so isn't Hashem's speech also a mitzias? Fine, I'm bottled to Hashem's speech, but Hashem's speech is a mitzias. It's something, it's a certain energy which left Kaviyachal Hashem, just like the speech of man. It leaves me as a separate entity. Remember we spoke then that one many times would love to take back his words that he said, but you can't, because it left you, became a separate entity. So maybe here too, it's not bottled to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, maybe it's bottled to the speech of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the speech of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kaviyachal, left HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to say, and therefore becomes a separate entity. So no, the Alter Rebbe says, no, the speech exists by man as well. The speech is one with a machshava, with a thought. In thought, you don't even have the whole notion of structured words. But then the Alter Rebbe says, argues further, and he says, in machshava there is a concept of letters. We think in a particular language as an example. So the Alter Rebbe says, yeah, the machshava, the thought itself, is really batul to an area where there's no asius at all. There's no letters at all. It's only the person's whole experience, his heart, his emotions, or his intellectual appreciation to matters. There's no letters, so it's only the entire person. And there the Alter Rebbe says, and therefore the asius, the letters, are completely nullified and part of the system. The only thing is by man, it doesn't work exactly like that, because the moment it starts coming down from the, it is created, letters are created in the thought process of man. In other words, it leaves intellectual appreciation to matters, and it goes through his heart, and he's motivated and he's driven to something, he starts thinking about it, so then the letters are formed, yet they don't go backwards usually, especially when it comes to speech. It once it leaves the person, so it doesn't go back within the person. It becomes a separate entity. And again, as we mentioned, many people would wish they can take those words and put it back into the system. And the Alter Rebbe explains, but that's because we are here, and whatever leaves us goes into a different domain. But when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem is everywhere, so that really nothing leaves Hashem. Even this which Hashem speaks, which again, the whole point of speech is to bring creation into being, a structured type of creation, just like structured letters. When I feel something, you'll never know what I feel. You'll never know what I appreciate intellectually. And Hashem wanted that a structured world to come into being. And if I want something structured to happen from this meeting, I ought to talk. I ought to express myself in structured words, because I want a message to come out. And so too Hashem wanted a structured world, limited. Obviously when I speak, I'm limiting my emotions, because that's the point. In emotions, there are no isius, there are no letters in feelings, meaning to say, because it's overwhelming nafshistic experience, a soul experience, which cannot be contained in the level of heart. But from the way it is when I'm within myself, for myself, nothing productive could come out. It's a lot of light and a lot of soul experience, but it's too much for something to happen. I have to contain that, put it into a thought process, so it's a structure of letters, and then becomes structure of words. I could tell somebody how I feel. If I feel for the poor, for the vulnerable, I say, here, I feel for you. Here, take a piece of bread. I put it into words. Am I expressing all of my emotions? Obviously not, because it's put into letters which limit my experience the way it is in my heart. But nonetheless, that's where it's productive. The poor is going to take the dollar or go to the pantry, take a piece of bread, and again he's going to be mischaya. He's going to gain back his energy. And so to Hashem, Kaviyachal went away from himself, the way he's for himself by himself, and wanted a structured world. So he, Kaviyachal, he limited himself into Isius, into letters, and then into speech, Bidvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, or Basar Mamoris, Nivra Ha'ayim, like it says in the Mishnah. Mamoris are saying, structured saying, so a structured world came about. The only thing is, by man, once it leaves me, so I'm here, it leaves me, I can't put it back into myself. But Hashem, where He is speaking, and as such a world is created, but He is totally in the place where He's talking. There's no place which is devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the speech, even it leaves HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and as such creates a world, it's still part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the point of Hashem Elikim. Everything is Elikim. In other words, this was condenses and the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, the force of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Shem Hashem of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not separate from Hashem Hashem. Similar to the example we gave, the master, as he's saying that example, there's nothing, he didn't become a storyteller. As he's saying that parable, at the time he's saying he's saying that story, he understands, not only he doesn't lose everything about his amkus, his depth as a goyin, as a great and knowledgeable giant in his Torah, and again we use this example in his Torah knowledge, his grandness in Torah knowledge and profound Torah scholar. And for that matter, even when he says the mashal, like, the Medrash says a mashal about Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he says the mashal, every word he's already means the nimshal. He means the message. The message is never cut away from his perspective, from the child's perspective. Yes, it's a different idea. He's only able to take the outer layer because he cannot appreciate the inner energy of the teacher. Because he would divulge everything, he would lose it. If Hashem would just expose himself, nothing would mamash exist. But from the perspective of the master, as he's saying the story, the entire message is right there within the story. More so, his whole profound posture as a gigantic Torah scholar is there as he's speaking an example which could be perceived from the student as a storyteller. Nothing is lost. Hashem is everywhere. So when he speaks, the speech is always within. It never really leaves him, meaning to say he never really leaves. Perhaps easier to appreciate. He never leaves the area where his speech comes out to. So everything is really part of him. And if you think about from the ayin timotze, from the perspective of the master in the example we gave, or the perspective of Hashem from the ayin, where Hashem is, these letters and these words are not a separate entity. They're all part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like the Alter Rebbe says, I gave an example,